Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of Environmental History Worth Reading. I'm Sean Courage, one of the editors here at niche-canada.org, and as always, I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I'm the niche social media editor.
So we're looking back at some of the best web content for environmental history over the last month. We're looking at February 2017 here, and your first pick, judging by the feature image that you selected, deals with the bison. There were several stories about this, the reintroduction of bison to Banff National Park.
Yes, this is definitely the most popular story, and of particular interest to those of us who were at our summer school last year, which was in Banff, where we toured around Banff and the surrounding area to learn about this exact subject. So this isn't necessarily this particular article, but it's the news story that's important. 16 wild bison were transferred from Elk Island National Park to a remote valley in Banff. And they're hoping that they will settle well there and take off. So it's an interesting rewilding effort, and one that I think attracted a lot of attention from environmental historians as the rewilding subject is gaining more traction.
It was exciting to see this finally start. Last spring, you and I and other participants at the Canadian History and Environment Summer School got to actually go and see one of the areas where the bison were going to be reintroduced. And I don't know if you agree, but it looked great for bison.
Yes, indeed.
All right. The next piece of content you selected here also deals with bison. This is a 6-part podcast on the history of the bison in the United States.
Yes, I stumbled on this gem from Montana Public Radio, and I think they're going to put out one more episode, but it started in February, and it doesn't deal with Canadian topics at all, but it does talk about the bison in the U.S., and it's just a really great series. It talks about the history of why they went nearly extinct. It looks at Indigenous perspectives, goes to communities to look at the way that bison are integral to their culture. It talks to cattle ranchers. So it's just a wide-reaching embrace of this topic, and I thought it was a really excellent podcast.
Yeah, nice follow-up too on that reintroduction story. If you want to get a wider view of bison in American society and in American history, this is a great mini series of podcast episodes. Over at The Conversation, you've got an interesting article here featuring Adam Sowards talking about proposed or now finalized changes to regulations involving the Bureau of Land Management.
Yes, I didn't know about this, but apparently the Obama administration, one of the regulations that they put into effect at the end of Obama's term was the Planning 2.0 rule, which was meant just to further cement decisions about ranching, energy development, et cetera, on public lands. And it's likely that the Trump administration is going to roll this back. And Swords just uses this piece to look at the historical context of that and how the BLM was in the pockets of mining interests and ranching interests when it started, and how that changed in the 1970s. And so this is kind of going back to what the Bureau of Land Management was in its beginning. And Sowers argues that this is just going to open up the Bureau to more lawsuits and complaints, and also obviously environmental degradation.
Yes, and we're seeing already lots of colleagues in the United States writing in response to a lot of the recent flurry of rollbacks of environmental regulation, which brings us to your next pick. Nice work, by the way. There's some real connections here. We've got an annotated version of Scott Pruitt, the new Secretary of the Environmental Protection Agency, annotated version of his remarks to the EPA, his first remarks to the staff of the EPA. And this is annotated by Chris Sellers.
Yes, and I think other members of the Environmental Data and Governance
Okay,
Initiative,
yeah.
but I think he's the main author. Basically, it just goes point by point through Pruitt's entire speech, takes apart his historical arguments. The one that was shared the most that I saw was how they pointed out the misuse of a John Muir quote. Um,
Huh.
Basically, I just thought it was an interesting way of looking at how historians can use their knowledge for obviously an explicitly political agenda, I think, which
Hmm.
I don't see anything wrong with that. But um, so it's a way of looking at speeches and making it fairly accessible too.
Yeah.
It doesn't make these arguments complicated. The notes are very succinct. Um, Anyway, I thought it was well done. I thought it was very shareable.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
Good
an
example.
interesting alternative to what we've seen where some environmental historians in the last 6 months have been writing op-eds and articles like
Mhm.
Sowards. But then here we've got direct response, word for word in the text of the speech. It's a really good
Mhm.
use of the medium here
Yeah,
for levying that critique.
yeah.
Your final pick for this month comes from the Mining Landscapes website, a kind of think piece about the artifact.
Yeah, so John Baton asked the question, what happens when we don't assume that an artifact is always something tangible, always something obviously human, and always rooted in technological materialism? So he's just kind of flipping the idea of an artifact on its back, and what he's doing in this piece is mainly he's looking at contaminated soil and polluted water, and looking at what happens if we think of those as artifacts of industrialism. So I just thought it was really well done and an interesting piece to read.
And he's writing this in response to touring a decommissioned German mine. Yeah,
Yes.
this is great. Classic blogging. Went to a
Yes.
place, thought about something, wrote about it.
hmm
Excellent five picks here. We see some themes emerging certainly in the February picks for environmental history worth reading, and stay tuned for next month's picks from
Yes.
Jessica. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Sean.